Welcome, everyone. And on behalf of Informal Markets, I'd like to thank you for joining us at CPhI Discover for this session on navigating the CDMO market, hurdle, transformation, and opportunities, sponsored by Samsung Biologics. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Remind you that this is a live session, so if you have any questions during the discussion, please type them into the question box in your control panel. And please feel free to submit your questions throughout the session, as well as both for them, since we will be passing the most popular questions to our speakers to answer at the end of the discussion. So without further ado, I'm now going to introduce our moderator, who will be kicking us off today, and will make sure that you get to know the rest of the panelists in today's session. Rita Peters is Editorial Director of Pharmaceutical Technology Europe, and BioPharm International. She has reported and written about the bio and pharmaceutical industry from drug discovery throughout commercial manufacturing for more than 14 years. She's frequently moderator for conference sessions, webcasts, video interviews, and other industry events. Previously, she reported on and wrote about other science and technology areas, including contamination control, life science research, and R&D. Now, I'd like to hand the session over to you, Rita.
Well, thank you very much, Diana. And we have three panelists today, Eric Langer, Peter Shapiro, and Kevin Sharp. And to get us started, I'm going to have them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their perspectives on the state of the contract development and manufacturing market. So Eric Langer, President and Managing Partner of Bioplan Associates, I'm going to let you kick it off.
Rita, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit of our research that we've done over the last 14 months on the impact of the pandemic on biopharmaceutical manufacturing. We've done white papers, we've done a number of questions in our annual report, and it all points to what I think is a very robust industry segment. One of the questions we asked was essentially, how will you spend your outsourcing or R&D manufacturing budget? And what we see here is that essentially we're seeing over the years, and we're talking here, 14 years here, we're seeing very significant increases in the budgets associated with outsourcing of R&D or manufacturing. Next click, please. We see that the outsourcing budget have increased over the last 9 years, around 70% for every company. So this is not a trend, this is a reality. And we're seeing that especially accelerate during COVID. Where that outsourcing is going, just one of the examples where we can identify China. For US companies, China is the #2 possible outsourcing destination over the next 5 years. Globally, China also ranks very highly. This compares to 7 or 8 years ago when it really didn't even make the top 10. So we're seeing some very significant outsourcing shifts. Now, that being said, and we can get into this later in the presentation here. That being said, the change here in due to COVID has been the interest in reshoring and inshoring, and we'll talk about that as well.
Right. Thanks a lot, Eric. Now let's move on to Peter Shapiro. Peter is Senior Director and Editor-in-Chief of FarmSource, part of Global Data. So Peter, welcome.
Sorry, I think I was on mute there. Thank you. So today I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about a report that we do, which is now in over its 10th year. It used to be called the scorecard. Now we're calling it the new drug approvals and their contract manufacturer. So we see in 2020 that the FDA approved 121 drugs, representing a slight increase over the average of the last 5 years. And we see that the rate of outsourcing for small molecule API NMEs continues to remain high. And we've seen recently a significant increase in the rate of the amount of outsourcing for biologics. And we see that the total number of innovative small molecules and biologics has risen, with biologic NME approvals markedly increasing. And we also see that the amount of drugs being sponsored by smaller companies is increasing, which is also leading to this trend of greater API outsourcing. And this rate would be even higher if we included in this the emergency use approvals, um, which have an even higher rate of outsourcing than this. Not only do we see this high rate in small molecule API and increasing rate in dose, but we also see that the trend we saw the previous year, 2019, of sort of mega cap sponsorship has significantly reduced, which will also be good for outsourcing.
Great, Peter. Thanks a lot. Next, we have Kevin Sharp, who's head of alliance management for Samsung Biologics. So welcome, Kevin.
Hi, welcome, Rita, and thank you. And yeah, I think here at Samsung Biologics, we're on the front line here in terms of the contract development and manufacturing space. And over the past 10 years since our founding, we've personally grown at a significant pace to really position ourselves as a leading biologic CDMO. But I think really over the past year and a half, particularly with the COVID pandemic, which will be part of our discussion today, we've seen a lot of changes in the industry, a lot of challenges, as well as a lot of opportunities. And really that came at a time when there was already an expected growth in biologics product approvals coming into the market, which is quickly over the next 5 to 10 years exceeding from a demand perspective the oversupply capacity that is available in the market. So it's really a critical time at this point for both innovators and CDMOs to really revisit supply chain strategies in terms of investment in more capacity. And you'll see a lot of that taking place, particularly in the CDMO space, not only at Samsung Biologics, but really across the industry. Quite a heavy investment in contract manufacturing to really support that growth of biologic product introduction into the market and overall demand that we do again foresee in the next 5 to 10 years. So look forward to today's discussion. I think we'll talk a bit more in terms of the challenges that we've been facing collectively, as well as the opportunities going forward. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much to our three panelists for that intro, and let's jump right in to our questions. So, the biopharma industries, their our ability to bring vaccines and some treatments to market in less than a year has been probably one of the greatest R&D success stories for the industry, especially for innovator companies, but also for the contract development and manufacturing companies who played a crucial role. So, Eric, let's start with you. What has been the overall impact of pandemic response on biopharma development and manufacturing, and in particular on contract development and manufacturing market?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. One of the biggest trends we've seen is that there is no real significant shift, dramatic shift. What we've seen instead is an acceleration of what's been there for literally 30 years. The industry, I think, according to one of our respondents to a study, said the industry has been preparing for pandemics all its existence. So this is really not unexpected. What that means is that, however, the industry is now seeing more facilities. I mean, these are all trends that we've seen over the last 5, 10 years even. More modular construction, greater staff shortages. None of this is new. It's single-use technologies. Obviously, single-use is critical in the pandemic response, but single-use products and devices were in short supply before, literally right before the pandemic hit. Now we're seeing it in spades here. This is really significant now. Other issues like continuous bioprocessing, process intensification, while those are longer term strategies in the contract manufacturing world, we're definitely going to be seeing more of that over the next 5 and 10 years. The pandemic, I think, is showing us that we need to be focusing on the next pandemic, and we need to be focusing increasingly on our ability to rapidly respond to something that is obviously life-threatening. But we also need to consider the fact that the pandemic is not the only life-threatening challenge we're seeing. All of the therapeutics and all of the problems that we are, the clinical issues that we saw, whether it be an oncology product being brought to market or it's the R&D associated with that, doesn't go away. So people are literally dying as a result of the shift in focus now from the from what had been to the pandemic. So this is a double hit on an industry that's really truly a critical to so many people. And the fact that we're seeing this the industry rise to the occasion, I think, is a tribute to the people that are actually involved in it.
Thanks, Eric. Peter, what are your thoughts?
So I agree with what my colleague said, but just like to add that we saw significant delays and disruptions in clinical trials, and we also will see the same in regulatory because of COVID, and this will continue to affect the entire industry for the next year at least, and it will affect those drugs that are not for life-saving conditions the most. In terms of contract manufacturing, CMOs signed contract manufacturing service agreements at an unprecedented rate in 2020 due to the pandemic. When we look at the rates of outsourcing for the products for COVID, the emergency use authorizations, we see that 50% of these drugs had an associated contract manufacturing agreement, and that includes all of the vaccines that were approved under emergency use approvals. So really, there's been a lot, and if we look at the 2021 rates, we see similar rates as well. And the real shift being to biologics and vaccines in particular.
Thank you. Kevin, what's your perspective as part of the CMO market?
Right. Yeah. So I think from the manufacturing perspective, we've seen a lot of challenges, particularly with the availability of capacity. Almost within a very short period, we saw that capacity dry up. Whether it was internal capacity within the pharmaceutical company space or the CMO industry, available capacity, and it was really agnostic to scale. We saw that at the smaller scales, and then all the way up to the larger scale manufacturing as well. Also, we saw some challenges in terms of meeting timelines, in terms of overall delivery, to try to fit in manufacturing into that constrained capacity availability, impacted overall timeline for products, in conjunction with the various supply chain issues as well, which really impacted overall production schedules and trying to manage around products, really the same products that or materials that everyone was vying for globally in order to produce very similar products. However, there were some positive outcomes from it as well in terms of I think we were able to execute at speed. There was a lot more, as mentioned, contracts in a short period of time, but from an execution standpoint, projects were executed, tech transfers were executed, approvals through emergency use authorization were executed at unprecedented pace that we didn't see in the past. And one other item, I think we saw some better interaction with the regulatory agencies as well. I think all of this calls for better collaboration between partners as well as our regulatory agency partners to work collectively, work remotely, virtually, to really support these products and introduce them into the market.
All right, thanks, Kevin. So we've talked in general about capacity shortfalls. Are there specific areas and specific functions that are problem points where there's need for expansion, and is more of that capacity coming up planned or coming online? Peter, let's jump to you.
So I think that there's going to be capacity problems in injectable dose. I also think that we are very interested in the viral vector production field, which is important for cell therapy, gene therapy, and now recombinant vector vaccines, which are being used for COVID. There was already a significant shortage of capacity in this field, and this has definitely been exacerbated by AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson vaccines, as well as some of the vaccines from Russia and China. And really, we have the number of drugs in pipeline currently. There's a very small amount of manufacturing capacity compared to what we would predict the number of approvals would be.
Kevin, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think Peter hit it nail on the head in terms of some of the growth spaces, particularly in the new modalities. We are seeing a lot of advancements in, again, the viral vector space, mRNA, cell and gene therapy. So I think you're going to see a lot of expansion and exploration there. It's definitely a new space, so there's unknowns in terms of what will take off in terms of new technologies. But it's definitely one where I think we're all aware that it's a place that has high growth potential. I think more traditionally, when you look at least in the biologic space, the monoclonal antibodies are continuing to grow with a strong pipeline across the industry, particularly in the large scale manufacturing. We're seeing a number of products that are coming into the market with significantly high demands would warrant the large scale manufacturing that we are seeing as remaining as constrained. There are a number of expansion plans in place, including here at Samsung Biologics, to grow that capacity in the market as well. So I think those two key areas are what we're seeing as potential growth and areas that expansion is expected.
Eric, do you have any comments on this?
I think one of the takeaways from the shifts that we're seeing is going to be the need for flexibility. The manufacturers today, whether it be for a monoclonal where 65 to 75% of the activity is occurring, is going to ultimately slowly be shifted over towards some of those advanced therapies, as Kevin was talking about there. The need for that flexible manufacturing, I think, is being pointedly brought to the front by the COVID pandemic here because of the shortages of single use. We're seeing that in real time, how that affects the supply chain. That's going to lead us to more regionalization. I think we'll talk about that later, but that's an important shift in that what's happening is the recognition that the supply chain really is not as robust as we thought it was. So much of the takeaway we're going to be seeing is that the need for us to focus as an industry to focus on the supply chain and how the supply chain needs to be developed so that it's we don't have this situation in the future is difficult. And that's going to lead in the short term to more, frankly, it's going to lead to more competitors. One of the reasons is that as you look to see that people look at their supply chain, they're going to realize they don't have a sufficiently robust supply chain right now, and the reliance on one or two key suppliers, while it's convenient and cost effective because it costs you $100,000 to validate a new supplier in this industry, it's not necessarily the best business decision to safeguard against future challenges from the supply chain.
Which, thank you, Eric, leads very nicely into our next question, which is to talk about the supply chain, in particular for materials. So, Peter, any research insights that you have on current constraints in the supply chain? Any specific products or technologies that are problem areas?
So we talked a little bit about viral vector before, and we talked a little bit about contract service agreements. So we're seeing sort of a similar numbers of service agreements in 2021 as we saw in 2020. And we see here sort of that biologics and in particular vaccines are quite high. It's sort of been very unusual to see infectious disease as the top indication, a top therapy area for outsourcing the second year in a row, as opposed to oncology, which is pretty much every other year. We see large increase in outsourcing agreements, in particular in sort of the higher tech biologic geographies. So we see, a lot in the U.S., a lot in Germany, and a lot in Switzerland. And again, we see, these really big shortages that already exist in cell and gene being exacerbated by vaccine development.
Now, with these shortages, sort of what's a pharma company to do? Is there work they can do with associations? Are there any industry efforts to try to minimize these shortages? Or what should they do internally to beef up their supply chain and make sure they can continue with their operations? Kevin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think identifying the right overall supply chain strategy is critical, and honestly, that includes internal, external, really all options in terms of how one can build a robust supply chain using the appropriate number of nodes globally to, again, really support primary manufacturing as well as secondary or expanded manufacturing as well. Really want to be in a position to cover any shorts in any of those facilities or capacity constraints that may be available. So building that right supply chain is critical upfront. And second, once you do start looking externally as part of that strategy, it's obviously finding the right partner that is a good fit for your organization in terms of not only being an adequate service provider, meeting all the other requirements in terms of quality. Culture fit is important as well. And again, looking at a lot of these agreements are very long term, 5 to 10 years. It isn't uncommon, and is really the norm. So it's really critical in terms of finding that right partner. And then thirdly, really looking from a planning perspective. I think it's even more critical now to plan even more ahead. We're seeing a lot of our clients just expanding the overall line of sight for their demand forecasting and applying that into their overall supply chain strategy. And then also implementing the raw material situation as well that's currently existing in the market. Hopefully we'll see that subside a bit, but it still remains a reality. It needs to be taken into account with the overall planning as well.
Yeah, Eric, any advice on strategy that companies can take as an approach?
Actually, we asked some of those questions, those very questions, at the beginning of the pandemic about a number of areas, including vials. Back then, the concern was that vialing was going to be the big bottleneck, and it turns out that there is generally sufficient capacity and sufficient flexibility to increase capacity, not just for vialing, but for many other products. The problem, it turns out, is availability and getting the capacity to the right place. So the challenge is not just that we can't produce it, but we can't get it. Again, it comes to a logistics issue. We can't get it from point A to point B where it's absolutely needed at this point in time. And that ability or inability to manage the supply chain distribution becomes frankly, a bigger headache. You can't just say, we're going to order that or we're going to pre-order that because it may be in the wrong spot at the wrong time. We can't hoard things, for example, and that's one of the challenges we're seeing right now. When we did it in our study, the question is, what can we do about it? I think there is going to be a huge post-pandemic effort to identify what the challenge is. A lot of PhD dissertations will clearly be written on this. But one of the areas I think that we're seeing most is that many of the associations, like the Bioprocess Systems Alliance, is very actively and aggressively going after the ways that single-use technologies can be managed more efficiently and effectively. So I think we're going to see a concerted industry effort to be able to solve some of these problems. In the meantime, we're seeing in our studies, we've seen that 70% of decision makers as a result of the pandemic are going to outsource more, whether that be contract manufacturing or other services. We're seeing 50% said that they're going to be focusing more on regionalization, which means the sense was that if they can control the pipeline, then they'll be less at risk for having challenges with their suppliers. And as a result, I think we're going to see, at least in the near term, perhaps even the midterm, shifts in the way that that business is done. But I think it will all be for the better, ultimately coming out wiser and smarter.
All right, thanks. And you mentioned regionalization, which is a hot topic. So obviously, even early on in the pandemic, there were, particularly in the U.S., renewed calls for Western countries to bring their API manufacturing onshore. So let's just talk about some of the pros and cons of regionalized manufacturing. Peter, let's go to you first.
Yeah, well, the political rhetoric around reshoring was occurring before the pandemic in the U.S. because of a right-wing nationalist government, and really we haven't seen this be like actual changes to the supply chain. We haven't seen a significant volume of pharma manufacturing moving from Asia to North America. And if anything, the pandemic has showed us the need for diverse supply chains that use multiple suppliers. We see that really China continues to develop its own internal CDMO marketplace, as well as much of Asia. And the majority of small molecule API manufacturing facilities are still located in China and India. So shifting this production to the US would be a huge undertaking and bring its own risks. And pharma has noted that many of these policy proposals have really underestimated both the time, effort, and money that it would take. I think one of the more interesting places about regionalization is something that people aren't talking about as much, which is Europe and ATMP production. So we see the UK really is by far the leader in Europe in cell and gene therapy production and has really invested a lot into this in Europe. However, there are real concerns post-Brexit about being able to conduct dose in such a short amount of time. We have new constraints.
Eric, your thoughts?
Yeah, and I agree. There's a lot of activity going essentially potential disruption. I mentioned before the second sourcing issue, and Peter mentioned China, and I agree with that as well, that we're seeing 5 years ago, contract manufacturing in China wasn't even permitted. So we're seeing a very rapid shift toward the ability to not just do it, but compete globally. We're seeing companies like Wuxi and others having invested heavily in innovative technologies like continuous bioprocessing. That is going to, when we see some of the data about why or where companies are going to be outsourcing that we've developed, we can see that there's reasons why China is coming to the fore. In terms of onshoring and so forth, I also agree with Peter that this is an international, global industry, and simply onshoring is not necessarily a wise strategy. It becomes an issue of flexibility. What that's going to do, though, I think, as I mentioned, was we're going to start to see these second source companies, including companies in China, where we can see that trend even advancing more quickly, where the domestic industry growing so much, maybe in some cases double the rate it's growing in the West. That is going to create a significant pressure on the domestic industry in China to be able to produce for their industry in China. And what that does is it doesn't matter if you're talking about assays or you're talking about single-use technologies or you're talking about APIs. At some point in the near future, we are already beginning to see bag manufacturing in China for single-use technologies that will be produced for China. Downstream purification technologies as well. It's a matter of time before we're going to see those technologies introduced to the West. We're already starting to see that in some cases as we speak. So that level of increased competition from this rapidly developing dynamic market is just one example of where we're going to see the acceleration of trends as a result of this pandemic.
Kevin, what about your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of analysis that taking place, particularly as a contract manufacturer, with expansion, particularly into Western countries, and some of the pros that we've looked at as an industry. I think obviously there's logistic benefits in terms of the overall supply to patients, particularly in the regions that we're discussing here. There could be tax support benefits from the manufacturer's perspective, or even the pharmaceutical companies if they're building internally as well. So there could be incentives in terms of relocating or bringing facilities back or within the Western countries. And then the overall, I think, overall control of that product supply. I think we've witnessed that with the COVID treatment and vaccine supply that is more controllable with product that is produced within country, particularly from the governments that have some sort of control in terms of maintaining that supply within their overall country. I think from a opposite side of the coin, there most likely will see some cost increase. We are speaking of higher labor cost regions have an impact from an overall cost perspective in terms of producing these treatments. And then I think more broadly, we as an industry have become a global industry, particularly from a global supply chain. And when we start restricting and limiting some of those channels for supply, there could be impacts in terms of countries outside of these regions where maybe additional supply nodes are going to be established. And that could have some impact overall within the industry in terms of where is that balance. And again, I think that comes back to the overall supply chain strategy concept. I think having a balanced and diversified supply chain is important, and that includes all regions of the world.
Well, thanks, Kevin. Now let's turn to sort of the services that obviously the contract manufacturers can provide, but what role can a contract service provider play in a drug company supply chain? Kevin, can you take that one?
Right, sure. Yeah, I think there's a number of roles. Obvious, there's overall production of critical life-saving drugs within the industry is an important factor that the services industry can provide. But I think, that's a common statement. I think one point I'd like to focus on is, how can we be a buffer, particularly in situations like we're in now, where supply chains for materials and components are constrained. Within the industry, we've recognized that our buying power for these components and materials far exceeds our clients' buying power. And we've actually been able to leverage those relationships with the key suppliers to bring in raw materials, components, particularly these disposable materials that are very scarce at the moment, and really be in a position to, again, leverage those relationships, implement supply chain strategies such as localization, which we've done here at Samsung Biologics, where we've brought those key suppliers and helped them establish themselves regionally in the BioCluster hub here in South Korea, for example. And we're implementing these types of systems and structures within the industry that, again, allow us to provide above and beyond added value for our clients that goes beyond the manufacturing of the products.
Mhm. So what are some of the benefits of having multi-product manufacturing capabilities at a single location?
Yeah, I
Kevin?
think no, thank you, Rita. That's something that we've seen is somewhat of a trend in the past probably 5 years, and it's really up the pace now in terms of having multiple products within a single manufacturing site, particularly at a CMO. And what that allows our clients to do is, again, balance the overall supply between products. There's interchangeability of those products. So if demand goes up or down with one product, it can be replaced with demand of another product, which is very convenient. It almost acts as an internal site for some of our clients in terms of having that flexibility. On top of that, there's just the overall economies of scale in terms of having multiple. There's the ability to create synergies, efficiencies with your supplier, as well as leverage relationship for planning purposes as well. So, we're seeing a lot more dialogue in this space, and these types of multi-product relationships to grow.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm going to turn back to our market research folks. And are you seeing any trends in specific type of functions that innovator drug companies are outsourcing? So is there more analytics work,
Yep.
more development? Eric, I'll let you jump on that first.
Absolutely. There's increasing demand that the new technologies and the new advanced therapies, the things like continuous bioprocessing, perfusion, et cetera, beyond just a feeder bioreactor, all of these innovations require additional analytical services, assay development, et cetera, working with the regulators. So all of this stuff is pointing to the need for greater experience and expertise. And a lot of times it's the CDMOs that have worked on so many different products and projects that they have that experience that can often be a much more reliable move forward for some of the drug innovators. Other areas, like we mentioned, continuous bioprocessing and perfusion, you're going to expect more of that. We're going to see that in probably 5 years, maybe 10 years. It will be mainstream beyond just feeder bioreactors and so forth. So there's a lot of and many other exciting trends, I think, that we are seeing that CDMOs in particular have the unique skill set. One of those skill sets is staff. In one, Rita, you mentioned the availability of having resources in one place. A big challenge that we're seeing now is another accelerating trend is the inability to staff some of these facilities. And if you're an innovator and you've got a technology or a new product and you can't manufacture it, then you've got a problem. That necessity for flexibility then requires a relationship with contract manufacturers who could offer that. And I think that lack of staffing capabilities is one of the key areas that this industry is going to feel in terms of bottlenecks. We've measured that over 15 years or more, and we're going to be seeing that growing in the future as regionalization takes place. So many of these trends and support services that CDMOs are providing, especially to smaller facilities, are going to be beyond important. They're going to be required.
Thanks. Peter, what are you seeing?
So I think as Eric mentioned in the beginning, we see again the acceleration of existing trends. So one place where we see this is the continued growth in dose manufacturing, especially in injectable dose manufacturing. As Kevin said, there's been really quite a bit of growth in the protein and peptide biologic space, but we really are just starting to see this now in the cell and gene space, and really we expect to see significant growth in that in the near future. Acceleration.
So Kevin, what are your customers ask? What are some new things they're asking for?
Right. Yeah. No, I think from a technology perspective, Eric mentioned the perfusion technology and continuous manufacturing is really picking up the pace from our clients. We're seeing a lot more desire and need for higher production yields, titers within the overall products, ultimately to serve a larger patient base. So again, we're seeing it now already. It's being implemented. It's being implemented now at large scale as well. So it's something that's picking up some pace and definitely is going to be moving forward again in the next 5 to 10 years as more technology going forward. I think from a service perspective, we are seeing a bit more end-to-end service requests from our clients. There's a desire to, in some ways, stay with the development and then subsequent manufacturing of the product, mainly for retaining that knowledge and avoiding future tech transfers and really being inefficient in terms of a long-term supply chain strategy. And that doesn't necessarily mean staying with one CMO. It goes back to a diverse supply chain. But where there are possibilities for end-to-end service solutions, we are seeing again interest there. There's not a lot of I think, especially in the faster development and faster approval environment that we're seeing, transferring products from one location to another really impacts that overall time to market that our clients are facing.
All right, we've got a few minutes before we're going to take audience questions. So just want to hear your thoughts on if there's competition for capacity, then what strategies should drug companies employ to retain the services at CDMOs? Peter, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I think early decision making is going to be really important, especially in the spaces we mentioned where there's capacity issues. Understanding the volumes you're going to need, both for the clinical trial and for your overall market, and what companies are capable of manufacturing what. We've seen some really pretty amazing failures in this when it comes to the COVID space as sort of a learning example. Also, understanding clinical trial and market locations and how that may interplay with residual COVID-based delays, and understanding how that will have to interact for certain products that have shorter shelf lives.
Thanks. Eric?
I wanted to mention the impact of pricing on the industry. Obviously, we're seeing things like we're doing a build out right here behind me, and over 4 weeks, the price of copper wire went up almost 300% at big box stores. So you can't even put in wire, and that's for something as simple as that. Imagine something complex like contract manufacturing. Plywood went up. The price of plywood and lumber went up 25% in something like a week. So we're talking about pricing in overall, and as a result of COVID, really having an impact. But yet, for this industry, when we asked that very question in our annual report, we found that 66%, essentially over 2/3 of the industry, were indicating that from end users, not the suppliers, the end users are saying there was no price change. In other words, even though 71% of the suppliers are saying we're spending an inordinate amount of time holding our customers' hands, dealing with this and the customer delays and supply chain problems, et cetera, we're not seeing what other industry segments are seeing, which is increasing prices. So I think that's reassuring. I think it's an indication that at least in the short term, this industry recognizes who it is and its importance to the world.
Kevin, how is it from your perspective?
Yeah, one thing we're seeing is really, again, a longer look to the future and securing manufacturing capacity in advance. Before, probably, again, 2 years ago, we would never have seen some of these requests come in where there is, again, a forward-thinking mindset in terms of buying and reserving well in advance of traditional timeframes. And in particular, what we're seeing is it's coming across in terms of not necessarily a specific product, but potential products. And it's more about the capacity itself than it is about a particular product and a projected demand curve for that product. There is some bit of a transition in terms of how the innovators are thinking in terms of that overall supply chain outlook. And again, it's away from more traditional looking at a specific product and over cycle, what would the capacity be needed for that product versus a portfolio of products, and how do we secure enough capacity for this portfolio, and then manage that capacity going forward. So it is a bit of a mindset shift away from a product by product, more tactical planning to a more holistic portfolio planning, and then how does capacity reservation tie into that overall planning.
All right, thanks, Kevin. I want to jump over to some of our audience questions now. So here's the first one. So if reshoring to the U.S. is likely to be cost prohibitive, what are the best ways for biopharma to diversify its material supply? Who wants to take that one? All right, Eric, I'm going to pick on you.
Oh, bad. That's bad. Yeah, I think in terms of how we're going to address reshoring, I think there's going to be a lot of calculus done on the value of identifying what a second supplier is going to look like. We're doing research now on some of the complexities associated with the supply chain, and I can say that it is just simply identifying the suppliers out there to be able to define who and where they are. Is even the largest companies are not necessarily up to speed on that. So a first step is going to be some of the most basic. Where are the potential suppliers that could be second source that we could even potentially consider reshoring to? At some point when this pandemic is over, it's very likely we're going to shift back to some of the bad behaviors we've seen. It's also possible that we're going to see more M&A activity, at least probes for that, as companies recognize their shortages and their shortcomings in terms of managing their own supply chain. They're going to realize that they do need to not necessarily just reshore, but also potentially acquire some of their supply chain. I don't even think at this point in the pandemic we've even explored, many of the companies have fully explored what that implies. But I think what it's going to do is it's going to increase the likelihood of shakeup in terms of these smaller suppliers in the near future.
Kevin, Peter, you have any other comments on this question?
Well, as a fellow, business intelligence service provider, of course, agree that should be the answer. But a little bit overall, really looking at sort of more innovative models. I think spoke a little bit about modular models, and also the idea of maybe hub and spoke models and dual supplying, not only for sort of the largest products, which is where we're seeing it now, but throughout the ecosystem.
Kevin, any comments?
Yeah, and I think piggyback off of the Eric and Peter. I think it's going to be a balance. I think again, if seeing cost increase due to reshoring in the U.S., then I think it comes back to a diversified supply chain. How do we balance alternate supply across that supply chain, knowing that some of it will come at a premium from a cost perspective, and then others will again have to balance that out across the overall global network that's established. So again, I think it's looking at that overall supply chain strategy and what is the best model to really accomplish all the goals in terms of any geographic specific objectives, as well as overall cost objectives as well.
Kevin, I'm going to stick with you because our next question actually talks about models. So has this pandemic meant CDMOs have had or will have to change their business models in any way?
Yeah, I definitely think we've seen it already take place, and I think we'll see it. I think one is going back to execution and executing with speed. I think we've all been challenged on both sides, the client side and the CDMO side, to really go above and beyond the traditional ways of working and put together operation plans, capacity planning in place that really differs from what we've all done traditionally in the past. So there's definitely been that shift in terms of how we execute and operate. I think beyond that, I think we're going to see more of the end-to-end offerings as well. Again, if we're looking at an execution at a high rate or high speed, doing that within single facilities is more efficient and allows for quicker execution in terms of development, manufacturing of API, as well as drug product as well. And again, being able to do that more seamlessly, I think will be a benefit, a value add within the market. And again, we're seeing it already as a trend getting put into place in the CDMO space. And then we're also seeing it with the new technologies, the new modalities that are coming into play as well, expansion into that area, again, to complement the overall service offering for an end-to-end service provider is going to be critical going forward.
Peter, any comments about changing the CDMO model?
So I think that we've continued to see stress when it comes to efficiency and when it comes to hiring. I've never, seen government officials shilling for CDMOs looking to hire people before the pandemic. So it's clearly a stress point. And I think also government awareness of the CDMO market is a genie that's unlikely to be put back in the bottle.
Mhm. Eric, any thoughts on that?
Peter brought up the issue of talent and so forth and hiring. I fully agree that we're going to be seeing challenges in simply being able to manage the workforce out there. There are some CDMOs today that are using very innovative ways of recruiting and bringing people to their locations. And I don't think that I know that the regionalization and the interest, very likely interest among governments whose primary role it is to protect their citizens. When this pandemic is over, there's going to be a lot of soul searching on what could have been done differently. And so biotechnology, vaccines production is going to be starting to look at the next pandemic. And what that's going to do is even if it doesn't occur, there's going to be a lot of likely considerations for regionalization of production. And that is going to put an additional stressor on the ability to hire. So that we see some of these regional areas where we're seeing growth in the contract manufacturing and biologics manufacturing in general, those are going to put that much additional stress on the entire ecosystem. And the inability to hire somebody is going to start to put the brakes on the ability to produce a life-saving biologic. To the extent that we're talking about blockbuster drugs worth this much money, having 10 or 20 staff necessary to implement a perfusion manufacturing capability, and you'd not be able to find that becomes a major, major problem. And I suspect that one of the things CDMOs will be doing in the future is defining hiring and that HR function as a major component of their business model.
Yeah, Kevin, can you pick up on that? We did have an audience question that looking, as the technology is evolving, how are CDMOs going to keep up on the talent requirements?
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. It's a challenge we're seeing in terms of just bringing resources up to the appropriate level with new technologies that are developing at a high rate, and again, they're quite diversified as well. So I think part of that challenge is, which area do you invest? Is it in the cell and gene therapy? Is it in viral vectors? Or any of the others that we mentioned earlier. And I think that's one of the key challenges. I think once you kind of have a focus and a target, then there's an opportunity to work with universities, work with the local governments in terms of overall opportunities to bring in and recruit talent. But I think the overall dynamics and the potential overall directions which the industry could go and the technologies, that's part of the overall, I think, gamble in terms of, okay, where do we invest, not just from a technology capabilities perspective, but also from a resource perspective, and talent to bring them in. So I think, over time it's going to play itself out in terms of how it's developed. But it's definitely something we're looking at here in terms of bringing in talent that can execute across multiple platforms as efficiently as possible.
Well, thanks so much, Kevin, and thanks to Eric and Peter also, and thanks to our audience for listening in. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We need to wrap up. So, Diana, I'm going to kick it back to you.
Thank you. And I think that's all the time, unfortunately, that we have today. So just wanted to close with a huge thank you to you, Rita, Eric, Kevin, and Peter for taking part in this great session, for giving our audience some great insights and highlights on the actual scenario, initiatives, and challenges ahead for CDMO. Also to our sponsor, Samsung Biologics, for their support, and also thank you to you, our audience, for your attention.